With Kirby Air Riders having a day one patch and confirmation from Masahiro Sakurai that there will be no DLC to this game, the obvious question remains: how long do we have to wait until the next Super Smash Bros. Title? Now, in theory, of course, it might not be Smash that occupies Masahiro Sakurai's time next, but this seems rather unlikely given the huge success of the series, his own love for it, and his seeming willingness to return to it, plus the fact that there is huge demand. But if Smash is coming up, when should we expect it? What variables will affect the schedule? And what are the more subtle signposts we might look for along the way? Before we get too deep, let's just look at the precedents of recent games. With Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, we knew that the proposal was completed in December 2015 and the game booted up in February 2016 before finally coming out in December 2018. If we follow the same thought process and assume that a Super Smash Bros. Proposal is completed in December 2025, then we will be looking at a potential December 2028 release. However, that strikes me as rather optimistic. Game development times generally trend longer rather than shorter over time, especially with the Switch 2 being a graphically more powerful system. However, in Masahiro Sakurai's specific case, there's even more reason to believe it might take longer. Firstly, we know that his previous games were produced at an utterly frenetic intensity, which has not been good for his health, and I suspect it would be the rare fan of these games who would want him to hit the gas to the same extent again, just to shave a little bit more time off development. Air Riders production began in April 2022, and it seems like it will finish with the day one patch in November 2025. So already Air Riders, in a genre that Sakurai has always said would be relatively quick to make a game for, had 7 months longer a development time than the initial release of Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, clocking in at 3 years and 7 months. But there is more complexity to consider with the next Smash. Ultimate was building very extensively on what had gone before, and while it certainly added new elements and the models were redesigned from scratch for the Switch, there was at least a really solid template in levels and characters that had gone previously. Sakurai told Game Informer, "I definitely leverage all the know-how from past development." On the other hand, he also in the same interview noted the difficulty of assuming that recreating previous content would be a completely smooth operation, noting, "You might not expect it, but just reproducing the original work does not come out like it should. By emphasizing exaggerations, we are able to create elements in a way where having something realistic and comical does not look awkward, and being knowledgeable to an extent about each character is a must. There are also times when the staff go deep into the original work and add even better elements." Now here he's talking about bringing things over from other games rather than from previous Smash titles, but it still doesn't necessarily follow that if he wants to tweak some elements of Smash, that all of the assets that we used in Ultimate would necessarily find a convenient home in the new title. He also related to The Verge that he did see some flaws in Ultimate compared to his original ambition, explaining, "We envision the finished product and aim for that as we work on the game, so where we landed is certainly not too far from that initial vision. Even so, I feel there are still some shortcomings which I took as lessons learned. I have a feeling the notion of being proud of differs between Japanese and English, but I do not wish to boast about what we have accomplished with this product." End quotes. This certainly leaves the door ajar for what has, broadly speaking, been the trajectory of the series so far. A Russian Dolls Next Edition which absorbs as much as possible of the previous title, while also refining and building on it to make it a bigger and better game, while still having the same broad contours as the prior experience. In other words, an evolutionary title and not a revolutionary one. From Nintendo's point of view, how would they feel? Well, look, iterative sequels tend to underperform their original titles, but then again, Smash is so high selling that shifting 20 to 30 million as opposed to nigh on 40 as Ultimate did so far would still be a rip-roaring success. The big trick with this game would be getting back the many and varied third-party fighters. I don't disagree that this would be a formidable challenge, but given how well regarded both Smash and Sakurai are, and the capacity of financial rewards to lubricate the engine of decision making, I actually feel bringing back the entire Ultimate roster and building on it is more plausible than is sometimes supposed, although of course the temptation of money is that people start to ask for higher payouts, which might become prohibitive. Would it be miraculous? Well, yes, it would do, but Sakurai has noticed in the past that all Smash games are miracles, so that is something that is baked in anyway. All that said, Sakurai has previously signaled some of the ways that Smash might change going forward. He told The Verge, "I think we've reached the limit, at least in terms of volume of content and fighters. Basically, if I were to have the opportunity to work on another Super Smash Bros. Game, that means we would have to shrink the roster, but we need to think about whether the fans would be pleased about that. The current Super Smash Bros. Has too much of my personality poured into it. In order for a long-time series to continue thriving today, we need to think about eliminating the series' dependence on just one person's vision. Of course, this is the way it is now because we weren't successful in splitting the vision between multiple people before. This will be a challenge for the future and something that needs to be discussed with Nintendo if there were to be a next installment in the Super Smash Bros. Series." End quote. One possibility multiple people have brought up to me in recent weeks, and finding some evidence in this quote, is that Smash may well already be deep into development as a side project alongside Kirby Air Riders. This would not just explain the longer development time for Air Riders, but would also provide cover for Sakurai to take a lot more time to mentor the next generation of Smash developers, presumably still from within the Bandai Namco team that delivered Ultimate and Air Riders, but possibly also bring in talent from Nintendo, because I can't imagine that Nintendo themselves would want to rely entirely on a third party for the future of such a valuable series. The trouble is, this is all very well to say with no actual new Smash in the wings, but when it comes to the hard choices of game development, reality comes into play. First of all, just because Sakurai says a smaller roster would be likely doesn't necessarily mean that this is something he would actually be comfortable with delivering when it comes down to brass tacks, or that is something Nintendo could easily sell. It strikes me that the only way to pivot away from scale creep is to have some other core element, some new feature that distracts and draws attention away. Moreover, having a protege is a nice idea, but pragmatically, not everybody is temperamentally suited to working with someone in this manner. If these people exist, they exist at Bandai Namco, where Sakurai has now produced several successive games, giving a shorthand and comfort with the team. But while Nintendo may prefer that the heir apparent and their premier fighting franchise be internal to the company, Bandai is a loyal development partner of Nintendo and has even taken the step of setting up a dedicated Nintendo-facing studio, making official what has been evident for a long time, while they usually have two groups producing for Nintendo at any one time. Remember also that Nintendo is literally invested in Bandai Namco as well, with the express motivation of making this relationship function more smoothly. Still, all this does present a long-term strategic risk. Nintendo can copyright specific game mechanics until the cows come home, but if Bandai decide to make their own spiritual successor Pac-Man fighting game crossing over into every franchise under the sun, it will be very difficult for Nintendo reputationally to actually enforce any legal action, even though they might wish to do so to protect the Smash brand. I also think that while Sakurai talks of stepping back, he's also the guy that turned out to have done a couple of hundred videos in the space of a few months for his YouTube channel to disguise the fact that he had been working on a new game for years. He's also the person who was publicly very twitchy about the idea of Nintendo doing something with Smash without his input. In the very nuanced and subtle manner of Japanese discourse, and in the context of a high-stakes professional relationship, this messaging about the difficulty of splitting the vision has the same effect as him coming out and going, "Don't even think about spinning it off without me, Nintendo," in a Western context. Sakurai is always respectful of Nintendo, and I think that respect is genuine, and as we'll look at, I believe that Nintendo has a lot more influence than is sometimes assumed, but he's not going to be frozen out of his own franchise, and giving Nintendo an heir apparent might be something he rather regrets if he were to find a successor too soon. Both Sakurai and Nintendo will want to ensure that their franchise is represented to the best extent, and so professional discussions will surely be had. This doesn't necessarily suggest friction or Nintendo trying to run roughshod over Sakurai's personal vision. Indeed, I sometimes suspect that as fans we place too much emphasis on aesthetic and surface elements of games and misunderstand that Sakurai as a game developer is ultimately going to be interested in the innate aspects of the core mechanics. Sakurai himself has commented previously, "I'm actually not paying too much focus on the surprise element when we introduce a new fighter. The surprise element quickly fades once the announcement has been made. Rather, I believe it's important to have a good balance as a game. In the past titles in the series, Mr. Game & Watch, Rob, and Duck Hunt Dog were some of the examples we offered outside of people's typical expectations. However, if we don't have these types of fighters, and we only had typical hero-heroine type fighters in the lineup, there's not much difference. It's probably not very interesting." End quote. And we can trace this principle back through many prior titles. The original Super Smash Bros. Wasn't conceived originally as a Nintendo mascot fighter, but as a distinctive IP called Dragon King, while Kid Icarus Uprising was conceived as a third-party shooter taking advantage of the unique glasses-free 3D capabilities of the 3DS before Iwata suggested using a past Nintendo character for this game. In such a manner does the relationship between the developers both within and outside Nintendo usually operate. A developer comes up with a creative new puzzle game. Nintendo, with their publishing hat, says, "Let's add Mario to it and call it Mario Picross." Or sometimes the reverse. The developers come up with a mechanic based around movement in ink, assuming that it will become Mario-themed in the end, and the decision is then taken to try to give it a distinctive IP and call it Splatoon. These are not small decisions, but they have huge, long-tail consequences. The Splatoon IP has become huge in its own right and has appealed to middle school players in ways that's completely different from Mario, and therefore has actually expanded Nintendo in an important way. On the other hand, many games would wither on the vine without a plumber or two popping up in them. It's difficult to imagine that Dragon King Ultimate would have sold over 30 million copies on the Nintendo Switch. It feels likely to me that the next game will follow similar principles. Sakurai will develop some evolution of the core gameplay mechanic or even some flat-out new mechanic that opens up exciting new possibilities for play. Nintendo will then weigh in on how they want to position the franchise, which characters should be utilized, plus what legal and operational support they will need to put in place to ensure the game succeeds to its greatest extent. It's not that Sakurai, a famed perfectionist, won't weigh in on these matters, but at the end of the day, if he wanted absolute untrammeled autonomy, he easily has the fame and star power to net a massive budget to do with essentially whatever he pleases. He is in effect the Christopher Nolan of the Japanese video game community. I imagine the discussion would start with at least some acknowledgement of schedule. It's not that Nintendo want to lock Sakurai into anything. They've always been very comfortable with giving their developers extra latitude if required. But they also need to know what money they're putting in and for how long, and those discussions can't really exist independently of the early game development. Now, the request for the schedule will ultimately come from Nintendo because Smash is a major market-sensitive game release. If it releases near new hardware such as a mid-generation refresh, or in the twilight of the Switch 2, or even on successor hardware, all of this is going to have a massive impact, not just on the sales of the individual games, but also on subsequent events. We also need to recognize that one of Nintendo's major revenue sources going forward looks set to be their film and television works. Sure, the idea of the mega crossover has somewhat lost its sheen after everyone and their dog tried to replicate the success of Avengers, which, odd to relate now, was considered utterly groundbreaking at the time. Nintendo also seems to be keen to make productions that best fit the core qualities of each franchise, with Zelda being live action and Mario being an animated production with illumination. But the temptation for Nintendo to do the most obvious of crossovers surely can only be resisted for so long, and the chance to model to the cinema audiences the world of Pikmin, Splatoon, Metroid, and of course Fire Emblem could prove rather irresistible. I suspect that we're a decade or more from this being a thing Nintendo would want to pursue, but I can't be sure about this, and they may feel oddly that Sakurai's age and connection to the property makes them want to expedite rather than delay such an endeavour, giving him the prestige he deserves. Of course, Sakurai may find little enthusiasm for Nintendo's multimedia aspirations, and many would have legitimate concerns that drawing Smash into the world of movies might start to make it such a generic crossover franchise that it loses, with successive iterations, the appeal of those earlier games. At the very least, Illumination's Chris Meledandri must at some point have had the passing thought, though, of what would the minions look like in Smash. All of this makes predicting the timeline of the next Smash incredibly difficult. There are so many moving parts between what Sakurai wants to do and Nintendo's own corporate priorities, whether a game is currently being put as a side project or whether they're going to move on to Smash after Kirby Air Riders finishes up. Nintendo can set a schedule to their heart's content, and frankly, despite his reputation, Masahiro Sakurai is actually historically very good indeed at meeting those schedules. Sure, Ultimate released as late as it could in 2018, and Nintendo had new Super Mario Bros. U Deluxe on hand as an alternative, but the fact is, it did meet December, and every Smash game has hit the window Nintendo required of it. But would Nintendo blink if Sakurai decided he needed more time? No, they would not. It doesn't take too much of a leap of imagination to see how these timeframes could expand far beyond what currently seems plausible and what I'm sure they currently intend. This next section of the video isn't designed to stress test anyone's heart medication, and I'm not suggesting any of what follows is likely, but I think it's helpful in a discussion like this to sketch out the logical consequences of even those possibilities that might be destined to keep you up at night. So, for example, one concept I've seen mentioned a few times is going full-on Power Stone with 3D interactive stages. This would give a version of Smash that would complement rather than compete with Ultimate, and would therefore justify a second Smash on the Switch family of consoles without it feeling to the layman player redundant of past entries. I think this is highly plausible. Sakurai, who left HAL to avoid getting trapped in the rut of making sequels, may well enjoy the process of creating something brand new after decades of mainly focusing on refining the existing formula. What about Nintendo, though? Well, we can see there's at least one precedent of this already with the way Nintendo is treating its Switch sequel games. Mario Kart World has one very clear selling point that is distinctive from Mario Kart 8 Deluxe: the open world. If it had just tried to sell itself as the same as the past game, but with better graphics and fewer tracks, the game would still have been expected to do riotously good numbers, of course, but having something extra allows the two games to coexist without any ambiguity about what the new title offers, and frankly, without cutting the legs out of the ultra-successful Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. I know some people feel that Mario Kart World is short on content or doesn't pull off an open world in a way that keeps people sufficiently engaged, but that's a separate argument. The point is that in planning, Nintendo are clearly trying to carve out a major point of difference. Adding a third dimension to Smash stages would have huge consequences to the gameplay, though. It also feels a bit like past examples such as Tears of the Kingdom after Breath of the Wild and Donkey Kong Bonanza as a kind of spiritual offshoot of Super Mario Odyssey, where the developers took one new core mechanic and filtered everything they had before through the prism of that new mechanic, creating a game that in one sense is a direct sequel, but in another sense plays completely differently. Of course, a new element could be something far less drastic. It could be some aspect of how the battles are sequenced and chosen, a new additional mode or some refinement of an adventure mode. I love Splatoon 3, but as someone who has dozens of hours in it rather than hundreds, the refinements for the core turf battle mode over the past games strike me as quite subtle for the most part, except for the chance to play tricolor battles once a month and some different stages. But clearly, the dedicated community has seen the value in the sequel, and Super Smash Bros. Ultimate almost certainly has a stronger fan base of ultra-keen players even than Splatoon. But one thing's for certain, if Nintendo and Sakurai both agree that there needs to be a more significant and hopefully more high-profile point of difference from the previous title, that could make the game even more complicated to pitch, to plan, to refine, to develop, and ultimately to produce. If even Air Riders was approaching 4 years, a 4-year development cycle for the next game seems almost implausibly short. 5 or 6 years seems more plausible as a central estimate, but as this will take Masahiro Sakurai into his 60s, 7 doesn't seem out of the question, whether because he decides to prioritize his health over his apocalyptic workload, or because he tries to find people to mentor, which in itself could slow the process down, or even because of external events that cause friction in the development process, as we saw in 2020. Another complicating factor, though. A game like Super Smash Bros. Doesn't just thrive on the day one release, but on a steady drumbeat of DLC. Let's say the game had 3 months of planning and 6 years of full development before releasing in, let's say, March of 2032. If, like Ultimate, it had about 3 years of DLC following, it would be 2035 before the game was fully wrapped up. By then, Nintendo would almost certainly be working on some kind of more advanced hardware. Let's say Switch 2 replicates the success of the Switch, and distended generational timelines mean that the next system is released in 2034. It's certainly plausible that Sakurai could work around having a game that would adapt to a Switch 3 edition, but historically he has not really liked the idea of just upgrading past titles. On the other hand, he does like the unique features that are offered by different systems, the 3D of Kid Icarus for example, and has weighed in on hardware design before, such as suggesting a scroll wheel on the shoulder buttons. Moreover, if he had a game finished for 2032 and a system 2 years over the horizon in 2034, would he be happy just sitting on it, or would he look to expand and develop the current game he's working on even further to make it truly satisfying for the forthcoming system? A 2034 game would be releasing 15 or 16 years after Ultimate, an incredibly long period, but then Nintendo has gone more than a decade without new entries in even their biggest and most successful franchises before, notably Mario Kart, which, with the exception of Tour and Live Home Circuit, and of course 8 Deluxe, did not have a major new entry for 11 years. There would, though, be fully grown adults walking the earth who wouldn't have any recollection of a world where Ultimate didn't exist by the time the next Smash rolled round, and by that time, and on hardware 2 steps forward, the chance to do what Sakurai has always done and bring in as much content from the past games as humanly possible, however legally difficult, however bureaucratically time-consuming, would certainly be the obvious step, and in many respects the only way to meet expectations which by that time would have reached truly gargantuan proportions. Now, to repeat, I am not remotely saying that this eventuality is likely. It's certainly not what Nintendo's plan is going to be right now, I feel confident to say, partly because cutting Kirby Air Riders off is a sign that Sakurai and Nintendo want him to move on fast, partly because it would be economic madness to have their current generation dip out on such a colossal title, and partly because I think Sakurai's own intense work ethic and sense of duty to the audience would preclude him letting mission creep overwhelm his game development timetable that much. But if you look at Mario Kart World, conceived for Switch but eventually boosted to Switch 2, or if you look at Zelda Breath of the Wild, conceived for Wii U but ultimately delayed to target a Switch launch, and indeed if you look at Metroid Prime 4, originally a Switch game but now releasing on both consoles simultaneously, we can see plenty of precedents for when development times have extended to the point where moving it to a new console becomes the obvious option, and this might particularly be the case if the new console is a little sooner than we expect, because, for example, Nintendo want to do something far more experimental and want to have the comfort of having the Switch 2 as a more established brand rather than running it right to the end of its lifespan as they did with the original Switch. Having considered this, there is one other less likely option that we could consider here. If Nintendo's aim is truly to find someone who can imbibe as much as possible of Sakurai's production approach, then it might be that Super Smash Bros. Isn't the best venue for this to happen. We might expect that producers adjacent to the Kirby Air Riders team would be a good venue for this kind of trust relationship to build, and it may well be the case that Sakurai and Nintendo would like to see such a person or such a group proving themselves on a trusted side project. Sakurai has long discussed that he would like to see Kid Icarus Uprising on modern hardware, but he doesn't know that there's a team to do it, and so the emergence of such a team, or probably, more specifically, a producer who could manage that team in a way that would make Sakurai feel able to step back, might be a vital milestone towards Sakurai one day having someone he could entrust his franchise to. Of course, Sakurai wouldn't step away completely, and even if it involved less time in his day than Smash, committing to a Kid Icarus Uprising re-release would almost certainly push back the Smash window in a way that might be problematic. It's not impossible if the next Smash requires a longer period of prototyping and consideration that Bandai Studio S could take 12 months to break the back of production before the new Smash ramps up, but if so, we really would be eyeballing a next-gen Smash, but I don't think that's something any but the most fervent Kid Icarus fans would want as their plan A. Perhaps an even more obscure possibility is that they actually decide to remake a prior Smash game, presumably Brawl or Melee, or perhaps even a fusion of both, bringing them to the modern console where they can exist for posterity. Imagine a double pack in the manner of Galaxy 1 Plus 2 for $80. This fits squarely with Nintendo's approach to mentorship. How many times have we seen teams take on remakes or remasters only to graduate to full-on sequels? Grezzo on 2D Zelda, Mercury Steam on Metroid, Mages on Famicom Detective Club. If the heir to Sakurai is a group within Bandai Namco, they do have a lot of Smash development experience, but even so, a remake of previous Smash games, keeping well within the lines that Sakurai has set out, while not likely to scale the dizzy financial heights of Ultimate, would prove a strong testing ground and training program for a new team, and even if the demand for either title is smaller, I think we can say for sure it's there. It's also something that they could turn around far faster and possibly as a side project for Kirby Air Riders, meaning that we could see Smash on the Switch 2 as early as next year. Of course, Nintendo needs to be looking ahead and considering all the branching paths of possibility that future history could lay out. I would suggest that there are probably three major financial events that Nintendo will want to bear in mind: mid-generation hardware, next-generation hardware, and the low but not impossible chance of a potential Smash film. Firstly, the release of new Switch 2 hardware, possibly a smaller tidying up of the hardware without too much happening under the bonnet like the Switch OLED. Potentially, though, a fuller featured system refresh with a power bump like the new 3DS XL. I will circle back in another video to the considerations around these options, as it would potentially have a very significant impact on a Smash schedule, especially given how Sakurai likes to kick the tires of new tech. But either way, Nintendo is probably looking at a console generation of about 7 to 10 years as it stands. It's impossible to be exactly sure on this. Console generations are getting longer, but Switch's lifespan was perhaps artificially distended by being so successful around the pandemic. Once console sales start to ease off year on year, we can guess that Nintendo will want to lock into something new, but we also know that these decisions for the original Switch were only really made around 2019 or 2020. Still, a Switch OLED-style next-gen refresh we'd probably anticipate for around 2029 or 2030. It's not essential that Smash hits that window perfectly. Tears of the Kingdom was used in the original Switch OLED trailers, but didn't actually hit Switch for nearly 2 years after the Switch OLED launched. But I suspect that they will want the next Smash to have met enough milestones to confidently put it into the advertising window for their mid-gen hardware. If Nintendo did have any interest in some kind of Smash film, though, I can't really see it as plausible before 2029, when we might plausibly expect a third Mario movie, although spin-offs such as the strongly expected Donkey Kong movie and also a plausible Luigi's Mansion film could push another Mario solo movie to 2030. Nintendo's approach with such films, even though we only have one or perhaps two examples now to truly judge, seems to be to release new games afterwards, and this makes a lot of sense as you first expand the total audience by selling new casual players on your existing titles, and then pitch the newest game to your hopefully even larger total fanbase. Remember though, the purpose of these films is ultimately to serve Nintendo's hardware-software business rather than the reverse, and for reasons we've covered, pushing Smash too far into the twilight years of Switch 2 wouldn't be ideal either. So look, we've talked around lots of different options, but now let's try to establish what seems likelier. If I dropped by Nintendo's Kyoto offices tomorrow and sat in the corner while Shinya Takahashi and Masahiro Sakurai hammered out the details of their future plans, I would anticipate them setting either a 4 or 5 year schedule for the next game starting from when the game plan is fully worked out. Kirby Air Riders was seemingly very quick to get approved, but I think there's strong incentives on both sides for the next Smash to have a very distinct element compared to the past game, and so I could easily see a full development not ramping up until around April, with the next several months required to iron out specifics. Even if Sakurai has a vision in mind, and he's had years to think about it, prototyping and bringing everyone on board is not quick, and Nintendo has long experience of aborted games. A stitch in time saves nine, and all these creators are experienced enough to know that sweating the small stuff in their game will save millions upfront and potentially billions in opportunity cost if their proposed changes don't ultimately work in game form. That would give an optimum release window of about April 2030 to March 2031. On paper, the sweet spot will be October or November 2030, but actually I'm not so sure. This is likely to be a Pokemon New Generation year as well as a Mario Anniversary year. Furthermore, it is likely to either be the release year of new hardware or to be the year following new hardware. It may also be the year after a Mario film, and therefore the kind of time window where Nintendo might want to have a major new Mario release, which could push even a juggernaut like Smash out of the holiday window. I don't think it overly matters to Nintendo where Smash goes, as, a bit like Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, it will dominate sales wherever it lands, and so March 2031 feels as plausible to me as October 2030. They know they can't predict the fine details of game releases many years out, but what they can do is aim to flood key windows with as many huge games as they can. If we assume, as usually happens, that Sakurai sticks to this schedule, then we'd probably anticipate a reveal in 2029. The earliest reveal we're likely to see of new hardware is probably summer of 2029, which would be roughly consistent with the reveal time of the Switch Lite and the Switch OLED ahead of their respective launches. Therefore, assuming we'd see Smash reveal beforehand, so it can go in the trailer just like Splatoon 3 and Zelda Tears of the Kingdom made the OLED trailer, I'd probably anticipate a new full game reveal in the first half of 2029. This gives 6 to 18 months of build-up, which is consistent with previous major games from Nintendo Switch, but Smash in particular has such incredible hype, and Sakurai, as we've seen from the two massive Kirby Air Riders directs, likes to have intensive conversations with players, so there would be plenty of time for Smash hype to build. I certainly think that a release before hardware is less likely than after, given that while Nintendo do like to ramp up to hardware, the case of 2019 and 2021 show that the bulk of their big releases follow in the months after. In 2019, for example, Super Mario Maker 2, Fire Emblem Three Houses, and Astral Chain were all fairly big releases prior to the Switch Lite launching, but those followed a very fallow first half of 2019, while Zelda Link's Awakening, Luigi's Mansion 3, Ring Fit Adventure, and Animal Crossing New Horizons all followed quite soon afterwards. In 2021, there were quite a number of relatively small titles across the launch year, such as Mario Golf Super Rush and Zelda Skyward Sword HD, but Metroid Dread, Mario Party Superstars, Pokemon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, Pokemon Legends Arceus, and Kirby and the Forgotten Land all followed in the 6-month window immediately after release. Selling Smash alone is great, selling Smash and new hardware into the bundle has to be all the better. While I think 2029 for footage is likely, it's possible they could trail it earlier though. Think about how E3 2019 ended with a tease that the sequel to Breath of the Wild was in development. Smash is the same kind of title which is commercially sensitive enough to make a difference to Nintendo's stock position, while poor Sakurai might find denying that he's working on Smash more exhausting than just confirming that one is in development, but setting expectations that it's very early on. By the way, I should say that I don't expect that these schedules would change drastically even if a Smash is currently in development in parallel to Kirby Air Riders. While it's possible that they could have got a year or two head start, this kind of scenario relies on the fact that Sakurai would not be leading production, and so I imagine would be much more closely involved in mentoring, which in its own way would take time. It's possible that it could shave a year or even 2 years off the schedule I'm setting out, but given that there's a lot of advantages to having the game in the release window of new hardware, I'm not necessarily sure that it's in Nintendo's interests to try to rush the process all the more than it needs to. Now, all of this is probably what I would say is the central plan right now, but what if it all goes wrong? What if the game goes off track? If we reach a mid-generation console iteration and there's no sign of Smash, not even some whiff of an announcement, I would find that curious and perhaps indicative that the game is off course. I think the 2031 to 32 financial year is probably the absolute latest they could plausibly release the game before Nintendo might start to worry that the game is falling into the no man's land between the end of their last hardware and the launch of their next one. At this point, Sakurai might have to come either around the idea of having a cross-generational game, or Nintendo might need to wear a much more substantial delay to 2033 or 34. I suspect this decision will be a long way off, 2028 at least, and so I can't imagine any discussions of this sort are underway right now, unless, of course, they are going down the route of having the ports of the GameCube and Wii titles, which I think is unlikely, but is something that would be a way to keep Smash on the current Switch hardware while giving a long, long time to develop the next iteration of the franchise. Now, I normally try to put percentages to my judgments, As I always say, these aren't mathematically divined in themselves, they're just reflections of my own competence at the time, and I use them to see how well my percentages accord to reality to calibrate my judgments going forward. My current sense is that the 50% likely range for Super Smash Bros. Would be between July 2029 and March 2032, with the centre of that window being the centre of the bullseye, July 2030, March 2031, even the 2030 holiday season itself as a release window. Being more specific, I'd suggest October 2029 to October 2031 as in the 30% likely range. Any earlier, and I just don't believe there'll be new hardware to accompany it, and that might seem like a missed opportunity. Too much later than March 2032, and we might expect a more substantial delay. I will put on record a 10% chance, in my opinion, of seeing a new edition of Melee or Brawl, perhaps both even, by the end of 2028. This seems like the quickest route to giving the Switch 2 at least some kind of smash fix, but I just can't imagine it's anyone's plan A right now. A game sooner is possible, but would likely indicate something closer to a Switch 2 edition of Ultimate in all but name, which doesn't feel like the kind of waters in which Sakurai or even Nintendo would want to swim at the moment. A game later feels like it will be the consequence of events we can't currently foresee, but which are highly possible in the difficult and ever-changing world of video game development. I'm not going to put a formal forecast now on something so ridiculously far out, but the implied odds are low but significant that Smash could still become a next-generation title. However, that assumes that Nintendo sticks with the traditional generational cycle, or some only marginally distended version of it for Switch 2. Check back for a forthcoming video where I examine some other options that might get Nintendo out of a bind. Please do check out the Patreon, which really helps to keep this channel on the road, and if you like, comment, subscribe, and share the contents around the web, it would also help loads. But even if you don't do any of those wonderful things, I'm just so appreciative that you were here, and I look forward to seeing you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.